Jacked Up Review Show. It's a Jacked Up Review Show. Jacked Up Review Show. It's a Jacked Up Review Show.
Join us as we cover many an insane movie and numerous cult TV phenomenons. Are you ready to get jacked up? Are you with us? Then listen on.
Listener discretion is advised. It's a Jacked Up Review Show. It's a Jacked Up Review Show. Jacked Up Review Show. It's a Jacked Up Review Show. It's a Jacked Up Review Show. Jacked Up Review Show.
Welcome to the show. Got another special guest. We've got Benjamin Scrivens. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I cannot complain.
Nice. Thanks for having me on.
Just going into again music history mode, and just decided, hey, let's tackle another rock and roll great. How did you get into just covering, let alone listening to all the rock and roll music greats?
Well, I had growing up, I'm the youngest of four, and I have two older brothers and an older sister. And my two older brothers, so a lot of different, they were already into music by the time I was, real young. So I would always dig into their records and stuff. And they were mostly into like the early 80s, late 70s, getting into hair metal and stuff like that. But as I grew up, listening to like their influences and then finding out, you start tracing back, like, well, what's this band influence? Who's there? And then you read interviews or hear interviews. Obviously, this is way before the internet. And it's like, oh, they cite people like Jimi Hendrix or something like that. And it's like, who's that guy? And then, you kind of hear throughout the years, like Jimi Hendrix and, him playing the Star Spangled Banner and the Woodstock and different things. And as I got a little bit older into my teens, I had picked up the guitar at 8 years old. Both my brothers played, my one brother played bass, my other brother played drums. And I was gifted a guitar at 8, and I started playing. I took lessons, but I just didn't stick with it because I didn't learn what I wanted to learn. And then I gave it up. And then at 16 or so, I picked it back up because I was huge into punk and started playing punk. And then I got really into blues a couple of years after that. And that's really when my journey started into a lot of music from, the classic rock era. And again, being guitar oriented, I found Jimi Hendrix and or at least started listening to him more. I mean, of course, I've heard the songs that were on the radio, like Hey Joe or Purple Haze or things like that, but started getting into, a little bit, I don't want to say deeper dive, but like Dolly Dagger and other things that I had not really, Freedom and these songs I hadn't really heard before. And then like Red House and the acoustic version of that. And I was like, or Hear My Train Come In. And it's just like all these songs, and just started learning more about it. Did it. It came out, I believe, in the 70s. That's an amazing documentary on him. I think now it's on Amazon Prime. But anyway, that was sort of like really, so we're talking, for me, this was mid to late 90s that I really, really got into his stuff.
So in other words, you had good parents.
Yeah, well, it's funny. My parents, they didn't, it's funny. My parents are very musical. We have a very musical family, but they didn't really listen to a lot of that stuff. So it was like, but they didn't mind that I listened to it. But it was, I kind of found my own way to it. It was interesting.
Totally. And so I could not listen. I always had a bunch of different rock stations I was listening to. So I was, hearing all the various 70s and 80s rock and pop. So I always had just some giant, I don't want to say illusion, but comprehension of various titans, various giants, and what their place was in pop culture. So, I heard just about everything and by many of them. even if I wasn't staying up late, I was hearing a bunch of their music, so I at least knew the general vibe and why their lyrics appealed. And Jimmy was no exception. I mean, and I think it helped that there's been a lot of great PBS documentaries about him, as well as even a biography movie with Outkast's Andre Benjamin, also known as Andre 3000, playing him. So I think his folklore is definitely well known, and it's just kind of a shame that I don't really hear too many. The radios are just very unimaginative in terms of playing his music. Like I just hear, Over the Watchtower.
Oh yeah, All Along the Watchtower. That's one of my favorites.
Oh, it is, but I just wish they would show some other deep takes from him, or Hey Joe,
Yeah, no, I agree, because they tend to play the same ones, and I think these days especially, it's easy to overlook because again, you've heard these songs over and over and over again, and they don't. This is gonna sound very odd, but they almost don't mean the same because you've heard them so many times, and I think it's something where you have to understand when these came out. I mean, they're still, listen, his music is still amazing. And obviously when you listen to his guitar soloing and stuff, it's still incredible. Like by today's standards, it still holds up easily. It's not like something you go, oh, that was complicated 50 years ago, but it's not anymore. No, it's still pretty complicated. But I think when you listen to something over and over again, it dulls your sort of sensitivity to it in terms of what it's in the context of the greater musical landscape of the time that he came out. Could you imagine in 1967, 68, going to Monterey Pop or whatever and watching this guy take the stage, and maybe you've heard of him and you've heard some of his songs on the radio and he freaking lights his guitar on fire, it would have been insanity. I just couldn't imagine what that would have been like back then.
1,000%, because like you say, I think when I see bands that are listed as overrated, half the time, some people generally just didn't like that person growing up, but there's others where it just seems like they're just going on just what they heard on the radio. And it's just like, yeah, well, did you actually do a deep dive? Did you actually listen to a bunch of their hits from the various albums? So it is one of those where it's like, yeah, I think I can see, yes, repetition can work against you. I mean, now on the radio, I hear way too much of, Elton John and Michael Jackson. And it's just like, I kind of wish some of their less played material would be played. So, but.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. Like it's funny, back in the late 90s, listening to the radio, like at a job I was at, we would, we had the same station on every day, and it would play the same music, and it was like the whatever pop hits. So you're talking like Matchbox 20 and other songs, and to the point where I could not stand listening to, and I'm just calling them out as an example. I could not stand listening to Matchbox 20 because it's all I heard. And it's funny these days, if a song comes out of theirs, I've heard it so many times 25 years ago, but I haven't heard it in 25 years. I'm like, that's actually not so bad. Not that I'm like a fan, but I'm like, it's tolerable to me now because it's been 25 years. I'm like, okay, I can appreciate it. But back then I couldn't, I'm not saying that I'm become intolerant of like Jimmy's music or anybody else's, but I can see how people can become kind of desensitized to a point where they think it's overrated because they don't really see they just don't see it in context, I mean, it's hard for me to think that people could think about that about Jimmy, but at the same time, I kind of get it, especially when it's the same songs. You kind of lose something,
Everyone's got different experience. I mean, I've done it with movie stars where I'm like, okay, well, have you even seen this movie or that movie?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. But it's funny because like with someone like Hendrix, in recent years, I've been, I kind of stepped away from the guitar a little bit only because my life was busy and I had kids and I didn't play a lot. I wasn't in my band anymore. I just didn't sit down and play a lot. But in the last, I don't know, 7-8 years, kind of really rekindled my love for it and been playing a lot more. And so I've been learning more, and I've, revisited music by Jimmy because I love, When Christ Mary and certain things that he does. And there's certain chords and progressions he does that I started learning. Not that I can play remotely as well as Jimi Hendrix, but I it made me realize how timeless his music really is. Again, it's not something where you can just learn it and go, oh yeah, that was some old, some old folky song from the whenever that I learned, or, no, this is like, you can spend a lot of time chewing on his music and what he was doing with that guitar. Like, and you can't put it into tab or musical notes. Like you have to, you can learn it, but he just elevated what he did with such feeling. And the guy was only 27. Like it just, when he died. So, you're talking, only 3 or 4 years of real height of popularity,
1,000%. Yeah. I can't think of anyone who hasn't even, seen him, doesn't know about him, hasn't been influenced by his guitar or his vocals for that matter. It just seems like.
Yeah. I think what the closest analog I have to that experience personally in my lifetime is Nirvana, because, yes, they were around in the late 80s in the Seattle scene, but, when they broke in 92, with Nevermind and Smells Like Teen Spirit, you're talking only 2 years, 2.5, maybe. I guess it was late 91. So, okay, you're talking 2.5 years of them being like the biggest band and the, popular and killing, grunge killed hair metal and all this whole thing. And again, he was 27 when he died. And it's like this, when you look back and go, wow, that was an insanely short period of time for the height of their stardom. And yet they still resonate today. And I just look at that like that with Jimmy,
1,000%. If you also had to just rank them, well, I get, people put every kind of person on there, Beatles, Rolling Stones. Where do you think he ranks? You think he's somewhere in the top 10, or is he more top 20?
So, I would have to say, it's hard, right? Lists are always difficult, but I would have to say he falls in, I would say he would end up in the top 10. And I guess, if you're picking eras, even if you're picking, say, the 20th century, which clearly covers a wide gamut of musicians, I would have to include some of the really early blues guys, going back to whether it was Robert Johnson or Son House, who's my personal favorite. But then, of course, there's, Beatles and all these other bands and things. I don't know, man. I think Jimmy could hit the top 10 with ease when it comes to influence and just ahead of his time.
Especially his many sources are going to cite him as the best electric guitar player, and I don't doubt that.
I would tend to agree. If you're talking electric guitar players and you start and you hone it into that, easily top 1 to 3, and that's, I don't even know who I'd put above him at this point. Obviously Stevie Ray Vaughan was heavily influenced by Jimi Hendrix, even though he had his own styling of Jimmy or himself. But he's got to be in the conversation at minimum top 2 or 3, if not the top on everyone's list, or at least my list.
1,000%. And it made sense to me that they were just he was just admired by everyone from Eric Clapton, Pete Townsend, and the Beatles, even Jeff Beck. So there you go. But even for just free records, and it's just another example of is like can't get a good guy down. Can't stand in his way, and it helps that he's also just really good at making every tune stand out and I think his, Army experience prior to his discharge did have something to do with his organization.
That's true. That's true. He was in the Army for what, like a year and a half?
Yeah, to avoid like some jail time. And, it is what it is. I don't know what he was doing riding around in stolen cars, but I don't know why people care, and I get it. Different time, different everything. Everyone's just like, oh, maximum punishment. How dare you? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, it's just a stolen car.
Yeah, I don't see him as some lifetime criminal or something. You know what I mean? He was a kid. You know what I mean? What was he, like, not even 20 at the time, or maybe 20? Like, it's just not. It's insignificant in the grand.
We would have lost such a great, guy had he been not made it to the stage. And ethics wise, it's just like, yeah, there's so many worse things. It's just like a stolen car is just going to be dumped in the middle of nowhere and you're not going to give a shit about it. So what? That is so minor, yes, compared to, I don't know, getting kids hooked on drugs or, any other just vicious attack or crime. It's just like, this is like, that is so minor. And yet that awful system that we've had set up that still exists today is just like, yeah, basically everyone wants just maximum punishment and sentences for just all kinds of offenses to where it's like, yeah, no, they're not even on the same level.
I thought he did Army, or he went to the Army in lieu of jail time, right?
Yeah, basically that was his.
It was his like sort of ultimatum or choice to make, right?
Kentucky, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it's sort of good that they gave him that sort of that chance, But it's funny to think. So that was 1961. Then he went into the Army. The Vietnam War broke out 4 years later. 3-4 years later, depending on whenever they sent the first round of troops. Mm-hmm. It amazes me that, like, it's funny. My dad actually. So my dad was was he born 70 or I'm sorry, 1940? Right? Is that no? What year is he born? I should know this. 42. 42. So he's actually a year younger than my dad.
Okay.
It was November 20th, 1941, actually. So I think about my dad, and my dad got out of the Army. He was in the Army as well. And he got out right before Vietnam. And I was just thinking, I know Jimmy was only in there for a year, but just to think if he had stayed, and if he had to go or something, like, I don't know. I'm just like with anybody, any little move you make, it can have ripple effects for many years. And clearly I'm glad that he didn't have to stay in the Army and he was able to get out, but it's
fortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, not everyone had that commander they could rely on or deal they could make.
Yeah, exactly. Like, clearly he did not, want to be in there, and he was recommended to leave. So that's good. I mean, he clearly had other things he needed to do in this world.
Don't you love also how he was basically protesting the Vietnam War and it got through? And nowadays, when people take some kind of political stance, it's, it instantly just is wildfire on social media. It's like it's talked about as being preachy or what have you. And now we got trolls who like to call everything woke if they hate it. So it's just like, yeah, this is before everybody was just even more political division. But I mean, Vietnam is definitely the start of where you get America being unapologetic about participating in wars, and you got more people feeling just disillusioned. Like, I know, I grew up during the Iraq invasion, so I was already, my folks were already just fuming. If you get drafted, we might have to move to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Not going to lose you. And I think this is just interesting how, he avoided it, but he knew how close he was. I think that was his way of saying, acknowledging, he could have had it so much worse.
Mm-hmm.
When we talked about the Doors and how, Jim Morrison was just apeshit crazy being around it. It just seems like, we like that experience, and yet, with the music they were playing together. But yeah, I mean, he's just even more just kind of like dangerous. He's in a much worse place. And, Hendrix definitely didn't have it as bad as so many other guys.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I never thought about it that way, but you're right. Like, in some way, I don't know. Like, and I, for what it's worth, it just felt like his sort of time was, he was kind of in, I don't know if it's the right place at the right time, but he kind of navigated through that life, right? Just to kind of ending up with, going to then play with these bands and then getting on his own. And it's like, wow, he was able to kind of get to that point where he was a megastar so quickly, and all of those things had to line up in his favor,
Totally. And much like many late artists, he dies way too early at age 27. He's kind of got a similar Bruce Lee death where everyone disputes how much prescriptions and sleeping tablets he had and when exactly he passed away. But it gets even more cray-cray when, like usual, any artist who's passed away, the record company always, every time, capitalizes on their misfortune.
Yeah.
Releasing stuff that hasn't been released or re-releasing it, and it's like, man, we haven't learned. They're still doing it. They did it with Tom Petty recently, so...
They did with Tom Petty. They released stuff that he wasn't approved.
They released a B-side to a classic 90s album he did.
The Wildflowers album?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was approved by his estate. It wasn't, huh?
I think it was, but it was just one of those still. I'm like, you could have released it back in the day. I mean...
Yeah, I know. It's a weird situation, and it's hard because, and I know there's been a lot of controversy over the Hendrix estate over the years. I feel like that has settled down, or at least has become controlled to a degree. I haven't really kept up with it too much, but it's hard because you want his music to live on. You want people to hear it. You want it to be accessible, but
especially when you influenced every kind of people.
Yeah.
Every kind of band, from Prince to Red Hot Chili Peppers to the Isley Brothers to even, Robert Smith and Alice in Chains. So that's just amazing to me.
Right. And if people weren't able to hear it in some way, shape, or form, it would have been lost in a way. I don't think that would have happened to Hendrix's music, but I mean, even some of the stuff like I've bought, and again, they might not have been, I don't know if they were approved or not. I thought they were at the time, but releases where, there was unreleased songs that had never been heard. And I think people love that because, they hear all the same ones over and over again. I mean, he only had 3 albums. So it's like not including Band of Gypsies, right?
Yeah.
So, if you knew there was a Hendrix song, I mean, they did that same thing with Nirvana. In mid 2000s, they released a song that had never been released before, and it's cool. I mean, it is cool. I mean, I don't like it from a standpoint of, if it's a record label or something just banking on someone's legacy to make money, that doesn't obviously sit well with me. But if it's done in a way that the estate and the people involved are okay with, in this case, obviously Hendrix's estate, that it's sanctioned, if you will, then I think it's really cool to hear those things, because a lot of that stuff gets cut for certain reasons. Like I remember, and not to derail the conversation going back to Tom Petty, but I did watch that Wildflowers documentary, which is really fascinating because that is one of my favorite albums. And there were reasons why they cut a ton of those songs because they didn't fit. You know what I mean? And to hear them now, it's like I love listening to them, but I get why they weren't on the album. And, whatever reason, the Hendrix stuff that didn't get released back in the day.
They kind of thought it was like the B-side, I guess. And they're just like,
yeah, it didn't fit the what they were going for, the tone of the album. And, I understand and respect that because that was a decision they made then. But it is cool to have a chance these days to hear those things, whether it's Tom Petty, whether it's Nirvana or Jimi Hendrix, anybody. If any of my favorite bands, if you told me there was a Lost Ramones album, I would be all over that in a heartbeat. You know what I mean? again, as long as it wasn't some cash grab, I mean, and you can kind of sniff those out, like, hey, here's another greatest hits by this artist. Oh, and by the way, this has been remixed. And it's like, okay. Like,
yeah, we talked about even more modern day rock artists and how they kind of would fade away even between 2009 and 2017 or something like that, and then just come back with a surprise album, and you've still been listening to stuff they did 10 years prior to even that. So it's like, yeah, I mean, it's very kooky, especially during COVID. I mean, you're seeing so many people who are having to literally work twice as hard to reshape themselves before they get in the studio and record anything. But yeah, I mean, this is before any kind of craziness. And I mean, I don't know what would have been next for Jimmy after those free albums, but I mean, even The Wind Cries Mary and Foxy Lady, I just typically am not surprised to hear that in some kind of movie trailer or even Purple Haze. It's just that there's so many winners that they're definitely going to get listed somewhere. And I've even seen this one band do this cover of Voodoo Child and make it kind of more electronic, and it's this particular song is played in a lot of action movie trailers and TV show promos.
Cool. So. See, I like the idea of turning it into a different genre. Like, for example, I love Stevie Ray Vaughan's version of Wind Cries Mary. Actually, Little Wing. I actually almost like his version better than Hendrix's, weirdly enough. And I love the version of Voodoo Child, and I think he did Wind Cries Mary at some point. And Kenny Wayne Shepherd does Voodoo Child. And look, I love listening to somebody's interpretation of those songs in a blues, the similar style. But to take something like that and to just put it into a different genre is to me is wild. I mean, and I don't mean just like to what you just said, making it electronic. I already have sort of an idea of what that could sound like, and that sounds. I would like to go look it up. And I don't even mean there's a lot of these days where you get on a trailer and they take this really hardcore, or not hardcore, but like popular song, like Smells Like Teen Spirit, and then they slow it down for dramatic effect, and you're whispering the music, and it's like, okay, I get it. Now, granted, they did that in Black Widow, and I loved it. The person who did that was amazing. I'm not trying to rip on anybody, but it seems to be a trope that's used a lot these days, where you're like, oh, they took that one song that's really fast and slowed it down. Or they took that really slow song and sped it up. It's like, I get it. But there are ways to do that, to almost use what was so advanced back in, say, 1968 and make it advanced today in a different style. To me, there's something cool about that,
1,000%. And I mean, it's better for everyone to even just know about a song, even if they're not going to appreciate it. I'd rather that as opposed to it be lost to the dawn of time.
Sure. I mean, if it turns somebody on to the original, I've always said that about remakes and reboots of movies. Like if someone goes to see that and they go, oh, this was based on a movie from 1979 or something, then great, go see that. And if you're into it and it gets you turned on to a fan, great. If listening to that Voodoo Child song, if somebody said you found out that was by Jimi Hendrix and they'd never heard of it before, I mean, how cool would that be? Like, I've actually watched some of these videos on YouTube, people's reactions to things, and it's so wild to me. Like, they'll take these guys or these women or whatever, and they'll come all walks of life. Like his first reaction or her first reaction to Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix. I watched this one woman. She's an opera singer, so she knows music. She's obviously well versed, all of these things, but she's never listened to Rush, and she listened to Spirit.
Really?
And it's her whole reaction video about Spirit of the Radio, and she had to keep stopping it and talking about it. And she's like, I mean, she knew Rush, but she'd never really listened to them. And so you're talking about somebody in 2022 having not heard that song and who knows music, or these, like, I watched these two guys watch Stevie Ray Vaughan. Like, it was a live video of him back, obviously, in the 80s. And again, I'm very familiar with how he played and what he looked like when he played and all this stuff. They're watching him, they're like, oh my God, like we're genuinely like jaws on the floor. That is incredible. 35 plus years later,
And they've been denied it all their life.
Yeah. So I really think, I mean, look, take somebody, you know, who's older or what, it doesn't have to be older, but like someone who might listen to a lot of music these days or whatever, and if they've heard of Jimi Hendrix, I'm sure, but maybe not have really listened to him, and you sit them down, I'm sure you could just type in reaction videos on YouTube. I imagine the reactions are very similar, where it's like, what is this guy doing? Like he's not on this planet when he's playing. He's one with his instrument, you know, the sounds. I mean, he turned the guitar. It's so funny to me, you know, you're talking what, 66 to 69-ish or so, you know, the Telecaster, really the first electric guitar was 1951, 52. I mean, you're talking 15 years later, the amount of, I mean, then it was the Strat, and then, you know, obviously the Les Paul with Gibson and all those other things. Those all came out in the 50s and then into the 60s. And he took from what was just a slab board guitar that was amplified, but not really, you know, distorted at the time. He created this sound that lasted for decades and decades and decades. I mean, the sounds that he was creating was incredible.
Totally. I haven't heard too many other people other than the perfect examples you described do any covers of it. Like, I haven't seen even anyone from Disney's estate, you know, try and include them on a random stupid, you know, kids themed album. But yeah, like you say, yeah, if there's some unusual way to introduce people to it other than just a random Wikipedia article, you know, go for it. But it does get a little frustrating how there's still just some people is like they've never just, it's not that their folks didn't like them or anything, it just wasn't on the agenda of, hey, I'm going to introduce you to everything. It's like, I think it kind of goes half and half. Some parents will, you know, go the extra mile to, you know, cue you in on some important stuff, and other times, I mean t-shirts have always been a big thing, and there's never been any shortage of just popular band shirts at all kinds of stores and malls. So, I mean, it definitely does get to that point where it's just like, hey, you know, if you don't find it during, you know, college, you'll find it through the internet or, you know, some other kind of way to know about certain things, you know? So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, you know, obviously my experience, and I'm sure yours as well. I mean, I'm 44. So like really when the internet kind of came to be, you know, I was already in college. In terms of like obviously clearly the very, very early days of the internet, you know, I was already in college. And so by the time it got to the point where, say, Napster, I'll just use that as an example because I think that was one of the first real times, at least for myself, I was using the internet for like, I was trying to listen to music and do all these other things. Right. So, you know, that was what, 2000. So I was already, you know, 23, 24. So I was already in my 20s. I had already kind of come across a lot of different music already pre-internet. And I think these days, clearly, you know, like you just said, if you hear the name Jimi Hendrix, within 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes, you can have learned all about his life. You can have pulled up videos of him on YouTube. You could have downloaded music, you know, legally onto your phone, and you would be pretty much ready to go. You know what I mean? You would have already had a crash course. And, you know, when I was younger, it was finding these documentaries on TV, or, you know, maybe MTV would have shown something, right? Or, you know, you heard these things, you heard people talking about it.
Definitely MTV classic something, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And you had to do a little bit more work. And I remember being even out of college, and in my early 20s, I was working and starting to really understand. Like, I just remember one day I was asking a buddy of mine, like, who sings this song? And I forgot what song, the exact, but it was Bob Seger. And I should have known that at the time, but I didn't, because he wasn't really on my radar, even though I had heard his music. And I started kind of diving into his stuff, or like Allman Brothers. And I mean, there was bands that I was getting into. I mean, in my high school days, it was Pink Floyd. I mean, I was listening to Pink Floyd all the time, you know, in addition to new music like Radiohead or anything else that I was really into. So it was like this, what do I want to say? I don't know what the right word is, but it was like this time of just renaissance of just like all of this stuff that I was taking in, the stimulus, right?
Better to ask now as opposed to later, you know?
Yeah, but it was this open time. And I think especially when you're a teen, as you know, you find these things like I said before, like my parents they were musical, but they weren't, it's not like they had like they musical in a different way, I guess. I mean, we were always involved in church choirs and stuff like that, and they loved piano and all these other things, but it's not like they had, like my mom had the first Beatles album. I actually have it right here. I mean, it's, you know, it's not like 100% perfect condition or whatever. It's fine, but I have it right here, and a few of her other albums. But I mean, she was into like Tom Jones and other things. It's not like she was listening to stuff that I would have listened to as I got older, except the Beatles. I love the Beatles, but I found them kind of in my own way, and I think that's good for some people. It's good to be exposed. It's definitely, and again, my brothers exposed me. Part of my love for hair metal is because of my brothers, and I listened to it all the time when I was a kid, and I still love it. But you know, when you find something in your own, and going back to Jimmy, finding it in your own way, like I found it, even though I knew him and I knew the music, I really found my interest in him because of the guitar, and then understanding like, oh, he was like insanely influential, like no joke, you know?
1000%. So now that we pretty much have summed up how to just kind of introduce people to it, how the utter appeal about it, and where he ranks, would you also just say that aside from the fact that he's mandatory for just any kind of guitarists and acoustics, that he's basically just immortalized enough? It's just like there's enough people who have heard about him, and if they haven't heard of him, they've heard of him through other people who've talked about it or shown similar, you know, shown the influence. So altogether, I mean, I think you pretty much have painted enough of a picture that, you know, that you just can't lose just signing up for him. It's kind of hard to go bad with just free albums, you know, in a short time span.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you know, when you put together like a Mount Rushmore, you just put together the influential people. And, you know, again, it goes back to, you know, when I mentioned before, like an artist like Robert Johnson, who, you know, was one of the, you know, the whole tale of the crossroads and how he wasn't good. And then he came back after a while and he was amazing. And then of course he died at 27, you know, this whole 27 club thing. And I don't mean just 27 in the sense of that's some sort of barometer or something, even though it is weird when you look at all the people that did die at that age. But I don't think, like, okay, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is when I think of Robert Johnson and as a guitar player and a lover of blues music, I can appreciate his music when I listen to it and understand the lineage and draw the connection from him up to, say, Chuck Berry or Muddy Waters, Johnny Hooker. And, you know, I know they're all different styles of blues, but, you know, you draw a line then into Eric Clapton. And then, of course, Eric Clapton with the Beano album and the John Mayall going into being so influential. Clapton is God. Now he's a superpower that influenced all these other people. And then, of course, Cream, and it just goes on. It's like the domino effect, right? And what I'm saying is Jimmy rose so much that I don't see his importance being sort of diluted anytime soon. And yeah, again, I know, like if I had talked to my son, he's like, Jimmy who? You know, he's heard of him, but he's not like he's listening to his music all day, right? But yeah. I still feel, I guess what I'm trying to say is 50, you know, years after his death, 50 plus years after his death, I think unbeknownst to many people, but known to maybe, you know, you and I and other people, his influence is still being felt. And it's not too far from the source. You know what I mean? Like it still burns pretty bright. It's not, you can go back and listen again, you can listen to that music and go, whoa. And not for nothing. And granted, the recordings were not as good back in the 20s, but you can listen to Robert Johnson's music and go, huh, this isn't the same as everybody else's. You can hear the beginning of something because they were so ahead of their time. Right. So I don't think, you know, people didn't catch up to Jimmy for a long time, and some of them still haven't. I mean, I think really after Jimmy, when you're talking about influential artists, at least in terms of the guitar, the next person in conversation is Eddie Van Halen. You know, I think, yeah, you have people like Steve Vai and Yngwie Malmsteen. There's tons of amazing guitar players. But in terms of real innovation, you go from Jimi Hendrix and then you fast forward 10 years and you got Eddie Van Halen. And after that, I'm not really sure. Like you had Stevie Ray Vaughan, but again, like he was, I don't know. Like I'm talking about someone who took the guitar and went, no, we're going to do this now. Eddie Van Halen was the only other person I could think of. And I'm sure there's more people these days, but they're not as maybe popular as those other guys got, you know?
1,000%. So I'll let you plug anything you're working on right now. It's been a delight.
Oh yeah. Thanks for having me on. I mean, anybody who wants to find what we're doing and what we've got going on, you can just go to fright-rags.com. I mean, you know, switching over to what I do, I mean, we basically, you know, are always putting out new collections of stuff. We've actually, you know, we've done some musical type designs as well. We've worked with Alice Cooper and Rob Zombie and a few other bands and stuff, but obviously we focus mostly on horror type stuff. But we've got new stuff coming out all the time, so you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all those things.
Excellent. So, thank you ever so much for being on here. This was a fun show to do.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
We'll return after these messages.
Hey, feeling down? Feeling low? Not enough podcasts about movies in your life? Why not try
They must be destroyed on sight.
the new Podcast Cure-All? Sure to get you right with the world and on a path to better living. We have exploitation, we have Italian horror, we have zombies, we have slashers, we have crime films, we have spaghetti westerns, we even have sci-fi and sex comedies. So take a dose of
They must be destroyed on sight.
as needed and let the hosts, Lee Russell, Daniel Harper, Paul Romali, and the odd guest host cure what ails you.
Warning, may cause atrophy, African consumption, black fever, bone shave, chin cough, colic, cramp colic, dropsy of the brain, elephantitis, grocer's itch, jaundice, mania, miasma, mortification, palsy, Pott's disease, rheumatism, scurvy, St. Anthony's fire, summer complaint, and worm fit in some people. Consult a physician before listening.
Did you ever see a film at such a young age it left you traumatized with cinematic wounds? Necrophilia. It's a dead issue, man. Don't push it. Cinema Psyops is a weekly podcast documenting an ongoing experiment on the mind of an unwilling test subject.
No one should have to watch this movie.
Oh, no one should have to watch this?
No one should have to watch this movie.
Surprisingly, it's not a topic that a lot of people really want to tackle.
I'm shocked, prudes.
I know, really.
Right?
It's the next sexual frontier that no one wants to explore.
I am, in the most sincerest of senses, disappointed in you.
It takes a powerful goddess like Connie, jam her arm down the monster's throat and kill it. Oh, I'm still tripping out over that. Even as a kid, I was like, I gotta find a girl like that. Every week, I get a new look of disappointment that I never thought I could get out of her.
Unimaginable. At 12 years old, you should not be watching this movie.
Obviously.
At 13, you should not be. 14, you shouldn't be. I'm not entirely sure even 17-year-olds should be watching this movie.
Just because you're offended by something doesn't mean that you have the right to demand that it doesn't exist. Watching this film again, I had all of this like little nerd glee with everything that kept
little
popping
history doll popping up
absolutely.
at you.
So I totally loved this film.
Hey, I know why you couldn't see that. It's because your brain's warped from watching this shit at 12 years old.
Yeah, this is a rough movie. I told you ahead of time when we were getting ready to do it that it was
How
going to be
could
a
you
rough
watch
one.
this shit at 12?
Because physical wounds heal, cinematic ones don't. Listen to Cinema Psyops.
Hey everybody, I'm Corey.
And I'm Zach, and we're the hosts of Podcasting After Dark, a cast dedicated to late-night horror and sci-fi of the 80s and 90s, often found on HBO and Cinemax.
You know, the movies your parents didn't want you watching as a kid. You can find us every other week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and Stitcher.
This is what you want.
This is what you get.
Greetings, friends. My name is Dean Legero, and I'm the host of the 3324 podcast. I invite you to join me and my lifelong friend Eric Kuber to come with us as we discuss the music and movies that shaped our life. Each week, we'll pick an album or film that we really connect to, and not only give you some great info and trivia, but also discuss, debate, and celebrate what it means to us and the journey it took us on. We also look forward to hearing from you and giving us some of your picks for us to check out and discuss. I think it'll be a really fun experience, so come along with us for the ride. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider and at 3324.buzzsprout.com. Thanks for your time, and welcome to the 3324 family.
It's time, let's check our cue, baby. Pair it with a couple brews, baby. We love good movies. We love the bad ones too. So we watch them all and pass their lessons on to you. Oh yeah. Everything I learned from movies helps to make life a little bit groovy. With a one-last plot holes of gratuitous movies. It's time to get busy with your friend Steve and Izzy at eilfm.podbean.com.
Follow us on the web on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The podcast is available on Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Anchor, Apple, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Feel free to review our show and leave comments on any of those sites. Thanks a million for listening.
It's a jacked up review show.